Hi, I'm Stephanie Arell. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about shame. I wrote a book on shame. It's called Affect Theory, Shame, and Christian Formation. It's a little pricey because it was intended for libraries, really. But it talks quite a bit about when we consider shame as an affect. And what that means is that shame is a biological experience. Another way of saying that is that shame is something, since it's an affect, that emerges in our body as a sensation that is not attached to our cognitive processes. That means that when we experience shame, we literally physiologically feel it without it being connected to prior experiences necessarily in our mind, in our thinking brain. So if we also look at shame with an affect theory, one of the ways to understand it a little bit better is to think about it on a spectrum. And what that spectrum indicates is a level of intensity. So at the least intense end of the shame experience would be episodes of embarrassment. I have a funny story about high school. Our lunchroom was made of 3 big rooms, and my best friend was at the other end of the room, and I was running and yelling her name, and there was a chair in my way, and I went to jump over it, and the back of my foot caught, and I fell, and everybody started clapping. It was very embarrassing. I managed it by bowing and continuing on my way, but it was embarrassing. I recovered, I laughed. Incidentally, shared laughter, is actually one of the best means for doing some eradication of shame. But I was embarrassed. So at the other end of the spectrum, at the high end of intensity of shame, would be the experience of something that's humiliating. Falling in the lunchroom wasn't humiliating. Humiliation tends to be affiliated with acts that have to do with some kind of systemic or systematic control of somebody's body. Any kind of experience where food is withheld, or the ability to shower, or the ability to use the bathroom. Torture is actually considered very humiliating, which seems obvious, but think about it on the spectrum of shame. If I'm going to disenable somebody to take care of their physical bodies and their just basic needs, that's humiliation. The important thing for right now to understand is that shame itself exists on a spectrum. That spectrum is on a spectrum of intensity. The least intense experience of shame is going to be embarrassing or embarrassment, and the most intense will be humiliation or being humiliated. What it looks like then when you experience shame is generally a downward cast of the eyes. In a small child, if you've ever seen anybody yell at a baby, maybe around a year old, maybe a little younger, 7, 8 months, that goes and sticks their finger in a light socket and somebody yells at them and the baby just collapses, that loss of muscle tonicity, that is shame. The other physiological expressions are our shoulders sort of curved inward. Anything that draws our body into this sort of closed or fetal position, like that, can indicate the experience of shame. So the eye contact piece is an interesting one, and it gets into another point of this video that I'd like to make or expand on, which is the difference between shame and guilt. So in terms of eye contact, generally, if someone's guilty versus feeling shame, they will look at you and their eyes may go side to side a little bit, but they'll try to maintain eye contact because they're trying to maintain a certain reality that may not match the one that you've experienced. In shame, someone's going to look away, someone's going to look down. So then what does guilt have to do with shame? Because people tend to put those two words together, right, in experience, and not really know what's the difference between I feel shame or I feel guilty. So this is the difference. Really, it comes down to the way that we inform ourselves about our self-worth. So someone who is shame-based or feels a lot of shame will feel as if they're not worthy or that something is wrong with them. Whereas someone has a guilt experience what they're going to tell themselves is that I feel like I've done something wrong, or this thing was wrong. They're not going to say something's wrong with me. Now, you can of course have guilt and shame, but in general, the way to distinguish the two experiences is one has to do, shame, with self-worth and the feeling of not being worthy, and one has to do with behavior. So I've done something wrong. I feel guilty about something. It's not an interiorly pointed experience. In terms of evolution, we first experience shame around 7 to 8 months, and theorists say different things about this. I specifically look at Sylvan Tompkins' work. I really like what he's done on shame and affect theory. So that's about 7 months. There are a couple different things that indicate shame in a child. They're not consciously capable of understanding human emotions or triggers. They're also pre-verbal, so these are little kids that can't talk yet, and so they have an experience of shame, for instance, when they confuse seeing the mom from somebody else. That gives them that physiology of being embarrassed, right? Because they've made a mistake in identifying the mother. Of course, this is a little bit difficult to measure, but the point to take away from what I just said is this is pre-verbal. It's almost as if we have no words when we have a sense of shame. To go back and distinguish that experience and when the evolution happens in terms of guilt. Guilt is a moral emotion, right? It tells us we've done something right or we've done something wrong. And so it requires us to think about it. So guilt evolves much later than shame in terms of our development, probably around the age of 2, when we start to know we shouldn't stick our finger in the light socket, right? A 7-month-old doesn't know what it means, no, yes, no, yes. They just know if you're angry at them. So some other things that distinguish shame and guilt. Let's go more to our adult lives. Well, shame is inward, guilt is outward, right? Guilt is towards our behaviors. Shame is towards our innermost being. In shame, we're likely not going to be able to function, and we're going to want to withdraw or get away from somebody. In guilt, you might want to go and apologize or go talk to somebody. Whereas in shame, it's going to be more like, I want to go away, I want to disappear. So the whole logic around both experiences are quite different. There's more to say about that, but let's go to another aspect of shame, which is what can happen with shame related to guilt, and then what that can expand into if we don't really address that sense of worthlessness that shame incurs. So shame and guilt may logically sound very different, and it's true, but they also can start to overlay on each other, especially if someone feels guilty and then never does anything about it, or never atones for it, or apologizes, or if you're religious and Catholic, you might confess your guilt. So if it's not addressed, it may morph and turn into shame. So doing something wrong and feeling guilty about it then becomes self-definitional. So now it gets turned inward and becomes shameful, right? So they can get messy. And then what happens then with shame, especially if it's not addressed, usually by some therapeutic means, and that doesn't necessarily mean with a therapist, it just means it's going to take a little bit more effort than sitting with it or apologizing, is that shame will turn into more shame. So if we feel this sensation of shame or any of its intensities, we may pull away, and then to re-emerge from that takes a lot of effort. So instead of re-emerging, it can create more shame, right? I'll give you an example. So if you hurt a friend and you didn't mean to, maybe you said something behind their back, or you withhold some information from them and you feel really bad about that, but you make a decision to maintain that position, you start to feel guilty about it. That friend starts to tell you what a great person you are, and then you realize, okay, but I really wasn't that honest with you. That experience can then turn into some shame. You may withdraw from the friend or not want to hang out with them. And then the next time they call you and ask you to go out, you actually don't feel like it because you still feel embarrassed for what you did, and that's then compounding more shame, so you withdraw from them further. So that's how it starts to get into this cycle. Now, that's a pretty benign example. Maybe some of you can think already of times when you felt shameful, or felt the feeling of shame, or carry a sense from unhealed wounds from your past that are essentially affiliated with a sense of worthlessness. Where that gets a little bit dangerous is when it feeds on itself, when it becomes more shame, or alternatively, when it turns into violence. Violence is not necessarily like violence in the movies. Violence can be subtle, and violence can be self-directed. It doesn't just have to be other-directed, but it can be other-directed. So this is where shame gets pretty dangerous. It's been studied extensively actually along this lines. And so this is a pretty well-proven phenomena that people that have a lot of shame will enact some sort of violence to the self or to others in the compounding of more shame. And so experiences that indicate this violence are any kind of self-harm, problems with eating drugs or alcohol that are not self-nurturing, right? That turn into being harmful to the self, or external violence, anger, irritability, intolerance with other people, hate crimes, violence in domestic situations. Generally, you can track some sort of shame history to all of those incidences. From the beginning, when shame is experienced or that sense of worthlessness is there, it's very, very important to address, I think, not only for oneself, but also for the human community. This kind of gets into one of my big reasons for even doing this video, that I strongly believe that in order to make a difference towards compassion in the human community, it's really, really important to do introspective work and to take a look at our own wounds and our own shame so that we don't allow that to interfere with our own health or the health of other people. So I want to say just a little bit more about what happens to us when we experience shame. And the easy anecdote that's coming to my mind right now is when we share something very intimate with somebody else and then regret it and kind of pull away and don't want to be near that person because we have to kind of fix that feeling of embarrassment or shame, depending on the level of intensity of it, depending perhaps on the level of depth that was shared, and that we kind of withdraw or run away or feel bad about ourselves after we share something personal. That's a real easy way, I think, because I can't imagine all of us haven't had that experience where we're like, ooh, I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have shared that to this person. I don't know them enough yet, or that was too much to share. So that's a little bit of like a shame experience. But what I want to say about that is, if you can imagine back to when that experience happened and what that felt like physiologically, maybe a little nauseating, maybe if you had a coat on, you'd want to wrap it around yourself, maybe walking away with a little bit of what I referred to earlier, which is that slumped shoulder. I think anytime you kind of analyze how you're holding your body, you can probably sense whether you're holding shame or not. That gets to this idea that we have these affective experiences in life that actually sit inside of us, right? They actually physically affect our bodies. They affect the way we hold our bodies, and they are in us physically. You know, one of the best examples of this visually, if any of you guys know who Rodin is, the sculptor, he has a sculpture of Eve in the garden where she's crossing her arms and turning her head away. I think that's a really good example of what shame can do to our bodies. So I think a good way to end this video is to refer to a few things that actually help mitigate shame. Because shame is by its nature an affect that inspires us to withdraw, one of the best ways to eradicate it is to be around other people. The qualities of the experience with those people are important. And so I will offer you two. One, I mentioned it earlier, but it's the idea of shared laughter. If we are together and we are laughing, the likelihood of anybody experiencing shame or feeling worthless is probably pretty small, at least for the moment of that laughter, that actually belly laughter, which is shaking us inside and filling our bodies with joy for that moment. That can help mitigate shame. The second thing is actually eye contact. So if somebody's experiencing shame, the desire is to turn away and not make eye contact. But by maintaining eye contact, we actually allow for an empathetic exchange with somebody that helps to mitigate feelings of lower self-worth. So a good place and a good way to start, if you do feel like you have some experiences of lower self-worth, is to start making eye contact with people and see how that feels.